Hey, welcome back to another episode of Revealed Apologetics. I'm your host, Eli Ayala, and today we're going to be discussing the relationship between science, math, and Christianity, the existence of God, these sorts of things. I recently watched an interview with John Lennox on how math points to God. Now, John Lennox is definitely not a presuppositionalist, but he does have a lot of good things to say that I think can be useful to someone who is coming from a more presuppositional perspective. But yeah, there are certain things that John Lennox would, things that he would say that I would disagree with. Of course, he's not a Calvinist, right? I'm a Calvinist. I think he wrote a book on free will, which I would take issue with in terms of how he defends his perspective. But that's not to say that John Lennox doesn't have lots of great things to say. I highly recommend you watch, interviews with him and even some of the debates that he's done. I think he is a super nice guy, brilliant mind, and greatly appreciate a lot of the things that he said in the particular interview that I will be referring to here. This is not by any means a critique or anything like that. It's just to kind of point out some important issues relating to science and religion and the existence of God. And this is kind of like when you first get into apologetics, traditionally, people kind of sometimes will often come at it from kind of the whole creation and evolution sort of perspective. And that's not really what I'm getting into here, but the language that has been often adopted, and this is, I don't know if it's still used in this way, but it's definitely assumed, especially when you talk with certain atheists and skeptics, is that there's this idea that science is somehow incompatible with the existence of God. And of course, we would obviously disagree with that. I don't even agree with like the language itself saying, you'll often have talks, even apologists will give these talks because it's relevant to what people tend to hear. Is Christianity or the existence of God compatible with science? And then we often talk about how we can fit them together. Dr. Greg Bahnsen was a renowned Christian apologist, philosopher, and seminary professor, and his life's work is now at your fingertips with Bahnsen U. Bahnsen U aims to bring seminary-level education to every Christian anytime, anywhere, absolutely free. Gain access to over 140 courses covering theology, apologetics, eschatology, and law, featuring sermons, seminary lectures, and more from the legendary Dr. Greg Bahnsen. Now, if you sign up today at apologiastudios.com and join over 13,000 users already benefiting from this incredible resource, you will not regret it. And soon, they're expanding with Bahnsen U Plus and Bahnsen U Live, bringing fresh supplemental learning and real-time engagement. Again, go to apologiastudios.com and start your journey today. And of course, if you guys have followed my channel for any period of time, you will know very quickly that I do not believe that Christianity and science are they're simply compatible. I actually think that science requires the truth of Christianity, as we often say that the necessary preconditions for science itself requires that the world be the way that the God of Christianity has revealed it. So I think it's important to kind of think about these things from a particular framework. I think that the faith versus science and this versus that kind of dichotomy is an example of the language of the cultural conversation being imposed upon the actual situation, and we tend to adopt that kind of language. And I don't think we should adopt that language, right? I don't think that there is a conflict between science and, say, for example, the Bible. Okay, what is in conflict are particular interpretations of various data and theories and conclusions that people draw. As many apologists say, and as many philosophers say, and as many people tend to say, science doesn't speak, scientists speak, and they come with their own worldview, their own presuppositions, these sorts of things. So again, hopefully you'll recognize that in science, our presuppositions matter greatly because they impact how we interpret the data that we come in contact with. Okay. Now, of course, if you're a Christian, don't be drawn into the very philosophically naive position that, we just do science, right? We just come into contact with the facts and we just let the facts speak for themselves and the science bears out the results, blah, 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 blah. Okay. It is never that simple. And you want to be very careful when someone, presents the issues in that very simplistic fashion, okay? The very idea that science is some neutral discipline with no bias, right, is itself a bias. So you want to keep that in mind. Now, what I'm not saying in this video is that I'm not trying to undermine science in any way. I do believe in the scientific method. I think we ought to follow the scientific method. I think we ought to use scientific principles, and I think that science is an essential feature of, the human experience and growing and learning and understanding the universe better. All I'm saying is none of that is done in a vacuum, right? None of that's done in a vacuum. Everything is done within a particular framework. As we often talk about in this channel, the importance of the necessary preconditions for intelligible experience. Science has certain necessary preconditions. There are certain things that must be true beforehand in order for science to even be possible, right? You need to have the universal conceptual immaterial laws of logic. You need to have uniformity of nature. You need to have objective truth, reliable cognitive faculties. There are a whole host of things that must be functioning first before the scientific enterprise even gets off the ground. Now, of course, you might have folks that try to undermine that very notion. Well, science doesn't presuppose any of those things. Yes, they do. So you want to be careful when someone kind of hand waves that, okay? Science presupposes transcendental categories that exist or must be in place, and they are not established or known through the scientific method. And this is why you want to think in terms of science as we're not just debating scientific results or hypotheses or theories, but we need to know how to get into the broader discussion of the philosophy of science. This is very important. Science is not done independent of a philosophical foundation out of which even the scientific method arises. And so you want to be very self-conscious of or aware of the fact that there is a philosophy undergirding every discipline that we do. Okay, there is a philosophy of mathematics. There's a philosophy of science. There's a philosophy of, whatever you want to, put out there. There's a philosophy that undergirds all of those disciplines. And so when we're challenging the skeptic, we're going to be challenging the skeptic not on some neutral ground. We're not going to grant the skeptic all of the goodies that science offers. What we're going to challenge is how do you make sense out of the utilization and consistency and reliability of those goodies in a worldview without God, okay? So when I was listening to this interview with John Lennox, I don't remember who was interviewing him. I think he is maybe another apologist or I'm not sure. But they did talk about the issue of faith and science, and John Lennox brought up the issue of faith and how the word faith can be defined in many ways, especially in the cultural dialogue when atheists and skeptics typically hear the word faith. They tend to have in that concept, when they hear that word, kind of baked in preconceptions of what they think that means, okay? Faith, I've often heard that faith is believing something on insufficient evidence or without evidence or something like that. It's very important that you do not, Christian, I'm talking to the Christians here, do not let the unbeliever define your categories, okay? The Bible speaks much of faith, and the Bible does not speak of faith as a blind leap or believing something without evidence or anything along those lines. And so what I appreciated about John Lennox's thoughts here is that he differentiated the utilization of the concept of faith as referring to religion, like the Christian faith or the Muslim faith or the Hindu faith or whatever, okay? He differentiated that from its biblical use, which is more appropriately understood within the context of faith being trust and belief, okay? Now, I think it's an important point to keep in mind that the Bible does not, the Bible assumes the existence of God from the beginning. This should be obvious, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God. It assumes the existence of God and says that it's foolish to deny the existence of God. That's the assumption of the Bible. So faith within the context of the Bible is a trust in a God who is there, he is assumed, okay? But he is trusted based upon his past faithfulness. And this is why the people of Israel are often reminded or they're told to remember and look back at what God had done for them. If you see this all throughout Scripture, God says through the prophets, did I not lead you out of the house of bondage and, cared for you in the wilderness, so on and so forth. Faith biblically is a trust, okay? Now, Dr. Lennox also pointed out that science as a discipline requires faith. Now, we want to be careful what we mean by faith in this context because we do not want to equivocate, okay? We always want to define our terms. I suppose, he's saying something along the lines that faith requires some element of trust or something like that, and in a sense, that's true. because science has certain preconditions, as we mentioned before, that is not itself demonstrated through the scientific method. So there are certain things that you just need to trust must be in place for you to even get off the ground and do science, okay? Remember, and you guys always want to remember this, science is not a free-floating discipline. Science presupposes ultimate commitments, okay? When someone says it doesn't, they're wrong, okay? It does. Commitments include the uniformity of nature, as we mentioned before, the reliability of our cognitive faculties, the applicability of logic and mathematics. This was kind of what they were talking about in the interview. Science presupposes a whole host of what we call transcendental categories, okay? So that it is true in a sense that science requires, faith and in some context. Now, within the presuppositional context, I would argue that faith in God, okay, and the existence of God are the necessary prerequisites for the intelligibility of science, because God is the one who grounds all of those transcendental categories, okay? It is God, by imposing his providential sovereign control over nature, that we can trust that tomorrow will very likely be like the past. This is the issue of induction, which is presupposed in all of science, but is not itself demonstrated through the scientific method. This was pointed out by David Hume, and Bertrand Russell speak on this as well. So you want to be very careful of the caricature of science versus faith. We would argue that faith undergirds science, and more specifically, the existence and revelation of God provide the necessary worldview metaphysical context out of which something like science can even arise. And I would say the epistemological context as well. All right? Now, Dr. Lennox also goes into kind of a historical reconnaissance of the development of modern science. And so he points out, obviously correctly, he knows this issue very well, that modern science grew within the context of a Christian worldview back in the 16th and 17th centuries. And he appealed to figures like Galileo Galilei, Kepler, Newton, all these sorts of things. And he pointed out an important point. It's not a nail in any coffin, but it's an important point that we need to ask the question, why did modern science develop in the West the way that it did, okay? And I think Dr. Lennox is spot on here. He says that belief in the development of modern science sprung forth within a worldview in which men believed that there was a divine lawgiver, okay? We need to recognize that only within a worldview that says that there is intentional order in the universe does something like the assumptions of laws and uniformity make sense, okay? And so if you're going to come from an empirical perspective, right, reject divine revelation and so forth, you don't get the uniformity of nature. You cannot justify the uniformity of nature empirically, because the uniformity of nature is not empirically observed, okay? You can observe regular patterns, but that doesn't tell you, there's no necessary tether from observing regular, consistent patterns, and there's no tether to connect to whether those patterns necessitate being followed with any regular consistency in the future, okay? How do we know that the future will be like the past? It is a logical fallacy to say that the future will be like the past, or the future will very likely be like the past, because it's always been that way in the past. You don't get that via observation. You're sneaking in a philosophical commitment, namely, you're assuming that nature is uniform. Now, which worldview makes sense out of that concept that nature is uniform? What worldview makes sense out of the non-empirical presupposition of the uniformity of nature? Well, it's not atheism, and many atheists have acknowledged that. Okay, so these are important things to keep in mind. Now, obviously, Dr. Lennox didn't go into great detail here in this particular interview, but I think it was an important point to keep in mind that there's a reason why modern science developed in the Christian West. It came out of a context that had a particular worldview, a particular understanding of the nature of how the world functioned and worked. And he also quoted Kepler. He said that Kepler said that God has revealed to us the secrets of the universe in the language of mathematics. And I thought that was pretty cool. John Lennox, pardon, that is his area of expertise, mathematics. And so when he speaks on that topic, I tend to listen. He's got some pretty interesting things to say. And I think that's very important. Mathematics is the language of the universe. And there's a reason for that. Which worldview makes the best sense of that fact? Right? So, again, very, very important. Science did not develop in a vacuum. It arose from a theistic framework, specifically a Christian theistic framework. Does that mean Christianity is true because modern science developed from within the context of the Christian West? No, it does not make Christianity true simply because modern science developed in a Christian context. You don't want to make that logical leap. We have to argue for that in a more accurate fashion, right? There's no logic, there's no necessary logical connection with the truth of Christianity and the development of modern science. However, there is a connection with the development and possibility of science and the truth of the Christian worldview. So you need to kind of draw and connect those dots when you're interacting with individuals pertaining to this specific topic. Now, you want to be very careful too, because there is often the case attributed to Christians of reasoning along the lines of what's called God of the gaps reasoning, okay? God of the gaps reasoning. And this, again, you want to be very careful. Now, Christians can be guilty of this. Indeed, I've been accused of being guilty of this very thing, wrongfully, okay? And I would say this if I were not a Christian, but I knew some of the arguments that Christians make, in their strongest form, I would not accuse them of God of the gaps. I might say, well, the conclusion doesn't follow, or I might challenge a premise or whatever. But you have to be very careful. A lot of skeptics will just put the God of the gaps kind of a Band-Aid. If I just say God of the gaps, then, the problem goes away, right? You're just trying to explain our ignorance by plugging God. Now, of course, that's not what we're doing, especially when folks accuse me of using God of the gaps reasoning in transcendental argumentation, okay? When someone says, okay, when I give a transcendental argument and someone says, well, that's just God of the gaps reasoning, that is an automatic red flag for me, telling me that this person does not understand the transcendental argument and what transcendental arguments seek to do. Because transcendental arguments are not predicated upon filling in ignorance. They're actually based upon things we actually know. We know them, okay? That we typically take something, okay, that is agreed upon by both the Christian and the non-Christian, and then ask what are the necessary preconditions for that thing. We're not trying to plug in gaps of ignorance with God. Now, so to say that the argument's God of the gaps doesn't actually, prove that it's God of the gaps. So you want to be very careful of that. That phraseology is often thrown around in these sorts of discussions and debates. Now, again, I think it's important to recognize that Christianity, as a religion, as a worldview, provided the soil for science to flourish. Okay? And so I think that, who's really good at this? Now, I might disagree with him on a wide host of things, but my friend there, Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy, I think has done a great job in showing and kind of disproving, at least in the YouTube world, common myths about the relationship between science and faith and these sorts of things. So you might want to hop over to his channel and check out what he has to say about those things in more detail. That's his area. Now, again, I disagree with his whole theistic evolution, these sorts of things, but I've greatly appreciated a lot of the other things that he's done in terms of common ground between himself and I. So I've learned a lot from Michael Jones. Appreciate him very much, and love what he's doing with. I think last time I saw him I think he was on with God Logic. Avery, who was on my channel here. We did a live stream. Did we do a live stream together? No, we didn't do a live. We pre-recorded. He was on there with God Logic, and they were doing stuff with Islam. So I think I'm very much appreciative of what's going on over there. God Logic as well. Got some great content against Islam. And but nevertheless, you can check out those channels. There are a whole bunch of different resources out there for you to kind of check up on these things and find answers to common objections and so forth. Okay. Now, another thing that Dr. Lennox points out that I thought was a very helpful touch point in terms of discussion and conversations with people is the issue of the comprehensibility of the universe itself. And he quoted Albert Einstein, who said that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. I love that, right? The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. Which worldview makes sense out of the fact that the universe is comprehensible and that we are able as rational beings to comprehend the universe? Again, I think this is a problem for atheism, right? Atheism is predicated on the idea of blind processes, right? Why would chance yield an orderly cosmos? That's a great question to start a conversation with. Okay. When in sitting down with your atheist and agnostic friends and family and so forth, ask that question. That's a good question. Okay. With respect to human minds, why would unguided products of chance be able to grasp the universe? Okay. Which worldview makes sense out of that? Okay. The same thing is applied to mathematics. I think it was Eugene Wigner, I think Dr. Lennox referred to in his unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Okay. You have this idea of abstract math, right? Math as an abstraction, astonishingly mapping onto physical reality. Okay. Which worldview best makes sense out of that, right? It ain't atheism. Okay. We would argue that it's best explained if both come from the mind of God. Isn't it amazing how we can abstract mathematical formulas and then actually map that onto the actual world? Which worldview makes sense out of our ability to do that and to actually come in contact with something true about the nature of the universe? I think it's an amazing indicator of the existence of God. Now, granted, I want to make a distinction here. These are evidences for the existence. I think these point to God, but you want to be very careful. Evidences are never a purely knockdown approach for demonstrating your perspective because evidence has to be interpreted. Okay, we can make sense out of the data that we come in contact with, but of course, the unbeliever is going to have their interpretations as well. Now, that doesn't mean it's pointless in bringing them up. I think even appealing to indicators of our Maker is very useful in discussion, and we should do that. However, you want to be very careful. Both the Christian and the non-Christian have their what we call rescuing devices, right? To save our particular interpretation was it's possible of this, and it can be construed that way. So they're never going to be, appeals to evidence will never be conclusive in an ultimate sense. And this is why I think the strength of the transcendental argument is a good undergirding companion to a discussion on specific evidences that point to God. Okay, so I thought those were a couple of things that were very helpful in the discussion. Now, Dr. Lennox also spoke about the issue of the reliability of the human mind. Okay, for example, he said that, or at least he reasoned along the lines that if materialism is true, our reasoning capacities are equal to the byproduct of blind processes. Okay, in which case would undermine rationality. And then he quoted C.S. Lewis, and I think this was entirely appropriate, and I love how he kind of incorporated Lewis quotes here, because Lewis, while not a presuppositionalist, often said things that were very presuppositional-ish, okay? C.S. Lewis said, any theory of mind that undermines the validity of human reason cannot be true, because you reach that theory by reasoning. I'll say that one again. It's a good one. Okay, this is very, very presuppositional. This is the presuppositional Lewis. Okay, he says that any theory of mind that undermines the validity of human reason cannot be true because you reach that theory by reasoning. And so the very thing, your theory that undermines the validity of human reason, you actually got there by using the very thing that you're undermining, which is an attempt at an internal critique. Okay. Now, granted, internally critiquing doesn't demonstrate the truth of Christianity. I want you to highlight that. This is what we're often accused of saying, right? Pointing out the insufficiencies and the weakness of the atheistic worldview, and it is weak. Okay. Don't confuse me. I think the atheistic worldview is weak. It's unintelligible at its base and is unable to provide a foundation, a meaningful foundation for those transcendental categories, those categories that provide the necessary preconditions for the intelligibility of anything else. I don't think atheism comes even close to providing that. Okay, but pointing out the weakness of atheism is not the same as demonstrating the truth of Christianity. And this is why you want to make a distinction, at least when you're arguing presuppositionally and transcendentally. There's a distinction between the internal critique and the positive case for how, given the Christian metaphysical picture, given the Christian epistemological picture and ethical picture, okay, the necessary preconditions for uniformity, intelligibility, logic, mathematics, all these sorts of things, they're actually accounted for given Christian presuppositions. So if you start with Christian presuppositions, these things make sense. If you start with blind processes, our minds are a product of a blind process of evolution, all these sorts of things, reason is undermined. But then, of course, the atheist turns around and uses reason to try to argue against your position. Okay? So again, these are helpful things to keep in mind, and they're good touch points in conversations to bring up. Hey, how do you account for this? Hey, how do you account for that? hey, what do you think of this in terms of our minds being able to rationally reflect upon mathematical formulae and then map that onto reality? I think that's a very, very powerful tool in conversation to kind of make the point, to point to a creator, and not just a generic creator. Obviously, we're arguing for the Christian God specifically, but pointing out to specific evidences, and then hitting the home run and bringing the discussion to the point that actually the God that these things point to are actually the triune God who's revealed himself in both general and special revelation, right? So again, the atheist here, if we can kind of consider C.S. Lewis's quote here, any theory of mind that undermines the validity of human reason cannot be true because you reach that theory by reasoning, okay? In essence, atheism saws off the branch that it is sitting on. And then, of course, if this were true, reason collapses if that worldview were true. So hypothetically speaking, if we grant this form of atheism, the very tools needed to rationally think, discuss, and debate are actually undermined. And then, of course, you have to now flip the coin. How does the Christian worldview provide those necessary preconditions? Okay? So very, very important. Now, Dr. Lennox also brought up an interesting thing with his interactions with his coworkers there at Oxford, and he asked the question. What do you do science with? Okay, what do you do science with? And a great way to pose the question, very simple, right? What do you do science with? And of course, Dr. Lennox is not talking about the tools of science, like microscopes, telescopes, and beakers, and test tubes, and these sorts of things. But the answer is actually we use our mind. And of course, what Dr. Lennox pointed out is that when he asked this question to his colleagues, often the case he finds that, interestingly, his colleagues are very hesitant of using the word mind, okay, given the fact that the mind brings with it metaphysical baggage. And of course, the modern university, especially something like in Oxford, and people who are other people who might be allergic to the category of metaphysics might not like to use the language of mind. And so what is used instead, if you're talking to the materialist, naturalist, metaphysical naturalist types, they will replace the idea of mind with brain. So we use our brains to do science. And of course, Dr. Lennox asks the question, okay, this is another internal critique here, right? But in conversational form, and this is why I think it's so helpful. He asked the question, he says, if you knew the computer you used in your lab was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? Right? And of course, the answer is no, you wouldn't, although there are people who will bite the bullet. Yeah, well, I'll still trust it. I mean, this is a good question to ask, okay? If we do science with our brains, but our brains are the end product of a mindless, unguided process, what reason do we have to trust it? And we've talked about this in past videos, but the issue of the evolutionary development of human beings, okay, there is an issue of the fact that evolution deals in categories of survival, not truth. And you don't get away with the idea of saying, well, believing true things aids in survival, because there are counterpoints to that very idea. Okay, that's not always true. Okay, there are false ideas that you can believe that will cater to survival. So I think this is an interesting touch point in conversation to bring up when these issues come to mind. Now, from the Christian perspective, we don't share those particular perspectives with the materialists, with the metaphysical naturalists and so forth, right? From a Christian worldview, we do not believe that the physical world is ultimate. Okay, for the Christian, the ultimate reality is God. The ultimate reality is a rational mind. So it makes sense that we reflect that rationality and that the universe reflects that rationality as well. Okay? And so from our perspective, we think that logic holds universally. Math maps onto reality for a reason. Okay? Humans are made in the image of God, and we're capable of rationality as well. Okay? What does the atheist worldview do? Well, the atheist worldview denies those things, yet borrows truths from the Christian worldview. Truths like order, logic, reason, science, mathematics, and all the other disciplines. If they are intelligible, it is being borrowed, because atheism cannot account for intelligible experience. Okay? They often appeal to skepticism at an ultimate metaphysical level. Pragmatism, well, we can't answer those big questions, but it works, so there you go. Okay? And so, again, I think that we need to be able to point these out in our apologetic interactions with others. Now, you do have forms of atheism that do affirm an immaterial reality. So this is important to keep in mind that not all atheists are strict materialists. Okay, you have people who hold to views like property dualism or epiphenomenalism or some kind of emergent mind theory with respect to the nature of mind, so on and so forth. But again, from even those perspectives, you have no ultimate source for these things, right? Immaterial mind is said to arise from matter on some of these views, right? Maybe you're talking to like an epiphenomenalist, right? So that mind is like smoke to the fire. So you have the fire, which is the brain. The smoke is produced by the fire. So you have one thing producing this other thing called mind. So out of the material brain is produced an immaterial mind, okay? And so again, a question to ask, right? How does something eternal, universal, and normative, okay, like logic, unless logic is not transcendent, they have people who hold different ontological views with respect to knowledge. But how does something like logic and reason emerge from something that is contingent and purposeless? That's a good question. That's a good question, a good touch point in discussion. And so again, what you'll find, obviously I'm making the claim, but what you'll find is that there are no good answers coming from the atheistic perspective on this point, okay? If the mind is an accidental or emergent thing, okay, there is no, and this is an important thing to keep in mind, there is no necessary correlation between our thoughts and truth. Okay, the atheist can't explain why immaterial thoughts map onto external order. Again, another good thing to keep in mind. And C.S. Lewis's principle, I think, still applies here that we made mention before, where he said that any theory of mind that undermines the validity of human reason can't be true because you reach that theory by reasoning. So even if we grant the mind, okay, without God, it's ungrounded. You still have a theory that destroys confidence in the reasoning process, and therefore it undermines that perspective. Now, Christianity does not suffer from these things, okay? Ultimate reality is God. Ultimate reality is a rational mind who grounds logic, mathematics, knowledge, etc., etc., etc. We're made in the image of God. Human minds reflect God's rationality, and we can appeal to consistency because only the Christian worldview explains why immaterial minds exist and why they correspond to the world. Now, the atheist can reject that picture, okay? In fact, they do, okay? But they cannot do it without secretly borrowing from those categories. And so from an apologetic standpoint, you want to be able to point that out, okay? They are operating on what Van Til and Dr. Bahnsen often refer to as borrowed capital. But of course, this also has its roots in Scripture because when you reject your maker and you do what the Apostle Paul says in Romans 1, you suppress the truth and unrighteousness, you do not give thanks to the God who's given you these tools. You do not give thanks to the God who makes science possible. You do not give thanks to the God who gave the necessary preconditions so that we can do things like science, develop medicine, all these sorts of things, okay? And what do? We accrue greater judgment in denying our maker, the maker whom the Bible says we have a knowledge of and we will be on judgment day without excuse, all right? So all of these points are really important to bring up in your conversations and see where the discussion goes. Obviously, I mean, it's going to differ depending on who you're speaking with. But I really appreciated the interview with Dr. Lennox bringing some of these points out because I think there's a lot to tease out of these ideas that I think will be apologetically useful. All right, well, that is kind of all I wanted to share today. By the time I'm recording this, if folks have heard me repeatedly announce the event entitled No Other Name, which will be in Pennsylvania, it's being put on by the Future of Christendom. Unfortunately, if you're watching this video and you haven't watched the previous one where I said this, unfortunately, the tickets, they're all sold out. So if you didn't order, you're done, right? That's it, okay? So we have two keynote speakers, myself and Pastor Jeff Durbin, and then there'll be a whole bunch of other speakers talking on a wide range of topics. I will be talking on the transcendental argument. I'll be talking about the important relationship between theology, apologetics, and evangelism. And then I'll be giving an 18-minute talk on Hinduism. Definitely I wasn't expecting to do that, but when I was asked to do that, I think that was the only option that was left for me. But that's okay. I love talking about worldviews and looking forward to kind of jumping in. Just as atheism cannot provide a rational foundation for science and knowledge and logic and intelligible experience, Hinduism can't do it either. Okay. This often gets pointed out. People say, well, what if you replace Christianity in the transcendental argument and plug some other religious perspective in there, right? So let's lay out the argument. So if knowledge is possible, Hinduism is true. Knowledge is possible, therefore Hinduism is true. That's a perfectly logically valid argument, but that's not a detriment or disadvantage to the transcendental argument. Because, you can plug in anything you want in an argument. The question is, can that thing you plug into the argument actually do the work of demonstrating the argument? I would argue, and have argued, Christianity can, atheism can't, Hinduism most definitely can't, and other worldviews as well. So, should be interesting. I'm looking forward to giving the talk. It's a quick one, but hopefully we can get into some of the nuts and bolts of the basic beliefs of Hinduism and then maybe offer some tips on how to engage a Hindu from a presuppositional biblical approach. All right. So super excited about doing that and looking forward to meeting folks and eating. We're going to be eating at some buffet that is going to be delicious. I've been there before. It's in Pennsylvania. It's very, very good. But I get to go there again. So yay, so super excited. But nevertheless, that's it. That's all I wanted to share with you for this particular episode. If you have watched all the way till the end, thank you so much for visiting Revealed Apologetics. If you have a question or a topic you'd like me to cover, you can reach out to me at revealedapologetics@gmail.com. Yes, I check my email. And you can give me video suggestions. You can give me a critique. If you have an argument against my position, you can email me there. I don't tend to read long YouTube posts because there's just so many of them, right? But if you have a specific point you want me to address, these sorts of things, you could email me at my revealedapologetics@gmail.com. I also have a blog. I haven't written in a while. I need to find the time to put some more content there and maybe kind of reach out to some folks to see if they want to contribute so we can get some more material there on the website. But revealedapologetics.com, there are articles there and you have access to a bunch of other things as well. All right. So that is it, guys. Thank you so much. If you've not yet subscribed, please do that. Click the notification bell, all that jazz. And until next time, take care. God bless. Bye-bye.